The US is attempting something extraordinary against Iran. It has already largely amputated Iran's seaborne trade through a naval blockade. Now, the Americans are preparing what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has called an economic D-Day, an unprecedented financial offensive designed to sever Iran's remaining economic lifelines and ultimately collapse the regime. But here's the problem. Iran still has land borders with 7 countries. It still exports gas through pipelines. It has access to Russia, Central Asia, and the Caspian. It has spent decades developing ways of trading outside the conventional financial system. And every time the Americans close one of those routes, it risks imposing costs not only on Iran, but on the countries surrounding it. So this may not simply be a question of whether the US can strangle Iran's economy. The more interesting question is, who chokes first? Iran, its neighbors, or the chokehold itself? So let's start by talking about what Treasury Secretary Bessent described as Washington's strategy as a 1-2 punch. The first punch is the blockade. The second is what he described as the toughest sanctions in history ever. And he was very explicit about the objective. Washington believes this combination can collapse the Iranian regime. Bessent pointed to Venezuela and Cuba as evidence that the strategy can work. But those examples are worth looking at more closely. In Venezuela, the US imposed a blockade on sanctioned oil tankers in December 2025. But just 18 days later, US forces captured President Nicolas Maduro and removed him from the country. So the blockade certainly increased the pressure, but we never really discovered whether economic isolation alone would have produced political change, because military action intervened first. Cuba gives us a much more interesting comparison. The US has sanctioned Cuba for more than 6 decades without bringing down the government. What's different today is the degree of economic isolation. For decades, Cuba survived because outside patrons continued providing energy, financing, and trade. Those lifelines have now narrowed dramatically. Cuba consumes roughly around 110,000 barrels per day of petroleum, but produces only about maybe 30 to 40,000 barrels a day domestically. So when this imported fuel disappears, the effects cascade throughout the economy. Less fuel means less electricity, means less transportation, less industrial activity, less tourism. That means fewer foreign exchange earnings. And fewer foreign exchange earnings mean even less capacity to import. It's a self-reinforcing economic contraction. But Cuba demonstrates something extremely important about sanctions. There's a difference between strangling an economy and strangling a regime. A government can ration scarce resources. It can protect the military, security services, and critical infrastructure, while allowing living standards for the wider population to deteriorate. And that means an economy can run out of resources long before the government does. Economic hardship only produces regime change if that hardship eventually overwhelms or fractures the institutions protecting the regime, namely the military and security services. And that brings us to Iran. Iran is not Cuba. Iran is considerably harder to isolate. It produces its own oil and natural gas. It has a substantial agricultural and industrial economy. And in terms of geography, it is completely different from Cuba. It's not an island. Iran shares land borders with 7 countries. So while the naval blockade attacks Iran's largest external artery, seaborne trade, shutting down the sea doesn't eliminate Iran's external economy. It changes its geography. Trade can move inland. To the west, there's Iraq and Turkey. To the east, there's Afghanistan and Pakistan. To the north, Iran connects to the Caucasus and Central Asia towards Russia. Iran can export gas via pipelines. And outside conventional banking, there are exchange houses, gold, bartering systems, and local currencies. which all can be used to move value. Now, none of these routes can replace Iran's former seaborne trade that's been blocked by the US. But that's where I think the central calculation becomes really important. Iran doesn't need to replace everything. It just needs to preserve enough to prop up the regime. Take Iraq. Iran exports roughly $12 billion of goods to Iraq each year, making it by far the largest of Iran's remaining land markets. Now, the US can try and close that route. It can pressure Iraqi banks, restrict payment channels, sanction companies dealing with Iran, and pressure the Iraqis to tighten its borders. But there is a complication. Iraq also relies on Iranian gas to generate electricity. So if the US succeeds in cutting Iranian gas exports, the economic damage doesn't stop at the Iranian border. Iraq potentially gets deeper electricity shortages. That gives Tehran leverage. Iran can accept payment in Iraqi dinars. It can use barter. It can allow balances to accumulate. It can work through smaller intermediaries. The system becomes less efficient, but trade still continues. And that's the same problem everywhere else. Turkey can replace Iranian gas, but probably at a higher cost. Afghanistan receives nearly a third of its imports from Iran. Close that trade risks, and you have shortages of fuel, food, and medicine. Pakistan's Balochistan region has an extensive formal and informal commerce that continues across the Iranian border. So every time the US tightens its chokehold, it faces an uncomfortable reality. Many of Iran's remaining lifelines are also somebody else's supply lines. So what does Tehran actually do, and how will it adapt? I don't think Iran will try and recreate the trading system it had before the blockade. Instead, it will probably build a smaller, more fragmented, and much more expensive external economy. Trade shifts from the sea to land. Large transactions become smaller transactions. Large banks give way to exchange houses and intermediaries. Payments move from the US dollar to the Chinese yuan, the Russian ruble, Iraqi dinars, and Turkish lira. Oil and gas can increasingly be exchanged for goods rather than dollars. Gold can transfer value where conventional banking cannot. And Iran can invest much more heavily in its northern routes, through the Caspian, through Central Asia, and ultimately towards Russia and China. Now, Russia is particularly important because Moscow now has enormous experience operating under Western sanctions. And I would expect that Moscow will be the professor and Tehran will be the student going forward in how to evade US sanctions. China is even more important because it provides both a market and an alternative financial ecosystem. And this is where we need to distinguish between efficiency and survival. Iran's alternative system doesn't need to be cheap. It doesn't need to be efficient. And it certainly doesn't need to support the living standards Iranians previously enjoyed. It only needs to move enough goods and enough money to preserve essential imports and the institutions the regime considers essential to its survival. But there is one choke point sitting behind almost everything that the US is doing, and that is the US dollar. A naval blockade can physically stop a tanker leaving Iran, but American financial power reaches much further. Washington can target the bank financing a truck crossing into Iraq, the exchange house converting Iranian earnings, the insurer covering a shipment, or a company thousands of kilometers away facilitating the transaction. That is what makes the US dollar-based financial system such a powerful geopolitical weapon. But there is a paradox. The more frequently you use a choke point, the stronger the incentive becomes to build a route around it. Russia is a striking example. Before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Chinese yuan accounted for only about 3% of Russian invoicing. A year later, it was at 20%. By 2023, around 60% of Russian trade was being settled in rubles and the yuan instead of the dollar. Now, were those alternatives efficient as the dollar system? Absolutely not. But they worked. Trade continued. And Iran has spent decades developing similar systems as the Russians. Which brings us perhaps to the most consequential actor outside Iran and the US, China. China has already signaled that it opposes the US's sanctions and pressure strategy. And that creates a much bigger test and a headache for the US. Washington can sanction an Iranian exchange house. It can sanction an Iraqi intermediary. It can pressure Pakistan. But what happens when enforcement requires the US to impose increasingly severe costs on Chinese companies and financial institutions? At that point, the Iranian sanctions campaign begins intersecting with the much larger US-China relationship. For Tehran, that's strategically useful. Iran would much rather turn enforcement into a dispute between Washington and Beijing than remain isolated in a bilateral confrontation with the US. And China doesn't need to replace Iran's entire global trading system. Like Iran, it only needs to help keep enough of it functioning. So this has increasingly become a contest of endurance. The US is betting that if it can close Iran's remaining escape routes faster than Iran and its partners can build alternatives, Tehran is making a very different bet. It's betting that it doesn't need every route to remain open. It only needs enough of them. And it is betting also that the cost of enforcing complete isolation eventually becomes too high for the countries around it. Because electricity shortages in Iraq doesn't remain purely economic problems. High energy costs in Turkey have political consequences. Shortage of food, medicines, and fuel in Afghanistan and Pakistan create instability, and forcing China to choose between Iranian trade and access to the US financial system creates an entirely different geopolitical confrontation. At the same time, the Iranian government can ration whatever resources remain. That doesn't mean the Iranian population won't suffer. Quite the opposite. The experience of Cuba suggests the population can absorb enormous economic pain while the state protects the institutions essential to its survival. And that's why economic collapse and regime collapse should not be treated as the same thing. So when Secretary Bessent calls this an economic D-Day, the US is making an enormous bet. The US unquestionably possesses extraordinary economic weapons. The combination of naval blockade and control of global financial choke points can inflict severe damages on Iran. But severe economic damages doesn't automatically produce the political outcome that the US wants. Now there are 3 clocks running. How quickly can Washington close Iran's remaining economic lifelines? How quickly can Iran, China, Russia, and Iran's neighbors build ways around them? And perhaps most importantly, the third question, how much economic pain can Iran's population and the countries surrounding Iran absorb before somebody changes course? The US is betting that Iran runs out of options first. Tehran is betting that Washington's choke points begin to fracture before it does. And ultimately, that may determine whether the economic D-Day collapses the Iranian regime or accelerates the construction of an economic system designed to survive without the US. Thank you.